All right, fellas, welcome back. We are on the final part of the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Of course, read by Sleepless Tales, as you know well. That's me, as you know well. Anyways, previously on this, we were hanging out with the fellas inside of the living room of the house of Gregor's parents. The fellows were listening to the sisters' epic violin recital, but they were starting to think that it was kind of bogus. We left off on a bit of a cliffhanger, not writ by the book, but by me, because I randomly cut out right in the middle of this some very important scene, which is probably annoying. But, sucks to be you. Sucks to be you, right? Anyways, we'll be finishing this today. We're on page 65. Let's, without further ado, let's get it started, I suppose. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, subscribe, comment, and favorite. Sleepless Tales, as always. Let's go. Mr. Samsa called out the middle lodger to the father and pointed his index finger, without uttering a further word, at Gregor as he was now moving slowly forward. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger smiled, first shaking his head once at his friends, and then looked down at Gregor once more. Rather than driving Gregor back again, the father seemed to consider it of prime importance to calm down the lodgers, although they were not at all upset, and Gregor seemed to entertain them much more than the violin recital. The father hurried to them, and with outstretched arms tried to push them into their own room, and simultaneously to block their view of Gregor with his own body. At this point, they became really somewhat irritated, and although one no longer knew whether that was because of the father's behavior, or because of the knowledge that they had just acquired that they had, without knowing it, a neighbor like Gregor, they demanded explanations from his father, raised their arm to make their points, tuggedly, agitatedly at their beards, and moved back towards their rooms, quite slowly. In the meantime, the isolation which had suddenly fallen upon his sister after the sudden breaking off of the recital had overwhelmed her. She had held on to the violin and bow in her limp hands for a little while, and had continued to look at the sheet music, as if she were still playing. All at once she pulled herself together, placed the instrument in her mother's lap. The mother was still sitting in her chair, having trouble breathing, and with her lungs laboring, and had run into the next room, with the lodgers, pressured by the father, who were already approaching more rapidly. One could observe how under the sisters' practiced hands, the sheets and pillows on the beds were thrown on high and arranged. Even before the lodgers had reached the room, she was finished fixing the beds and was slipping out. The father seemed so gripped, once again, with his stubbornness, that he forgot about the respect which he always owed to his renters. He pressed on, until at the door of the room, the middle gentleman stamped loudly with his foot, and thus brought the father to a standstill. "I hereby declare," the middle lodger said, raising his hand and casting his glance both on the mother and the sister, that considering the disgraceful conditions prevailing in this apartment and family, with this he spat decisively on the floor, I immediately cancel my room, and will, of course, pay nothing at all for the days which I have lived here. On the contrary, I shall think about whether or not I will initiate some sort of action against you, something which, believe me, will be very easy to establish." He fell silent and looked directly in front of him, as if he were waiting for something. In fact, his two friends immediately joined in with their opinions. "We also give immediate notice." At that, he seized the door handle, banged the door shut, locked it. The father groped his way, tottering to his chair and letting himself fall in it. It looked as if he were stretching out for his usual evening snooze, but the heavy nodding of his head, which looked as if it was without support, showed that he was not sleeping at all. Gregor had lain motionless the entire time in the spot where the lodgers had caught him. Disappointment with the collapse of his plans, and perhaps also his weakness, brought on a severe hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He was certainly afraid that a general disaster would break over him at any moment, and he waited. He was not even startled when the violin fell from the mother's lap, out from under her trembling fingers, and gave off a reverberating tone. "My dear parents," said the sister, banging her hand on the table by way of an introduction, "things cannot go on any longer in this way. Maybe, if you don't understand that, well, I do. I will not utter my brother's name in front of this monster, and thus I say only that we try to get rid of it. We have tried what is humanly possible to take care of it, and to be patient. I believe that no one can criticize us in the slightest." "She is right in 1,000 ways," said the father to himself. The mother, who was still incapable of breathing properly, began to cough numbly, with her hand held up over her mouth and a manic expression in her eyes. The sister hurried over to the mother and held her forehead. The sister's words seemed to have led the father to certain reflections. He sat upright, played with his uniform hat among the plates, which still lay on the table from the lodger's evening meal, and looked now and then at the motionless Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," the sister said now decisively to the father, for the mother, in her coughing fit, wasn't listening to anything. "It's killing you both. I see it coming. When people have to work as hard as we all do, they cannot also tolerate this endless torment at home. I just can't go on anymore." And she broke out into such a crying fit that her tears flowed out onto her mother's face. She wiped them off of her mother with mechanical motions in her hands. "Child," said the father sympathetically, and with obvious appreciation, "then what should we do?" The sister only shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the perplexity which, in contrast to her previous confidence, had now come over her while she was crying. "If only he understood us," said the father in a semi-questioning tone. The sister, in the midst of her sobbing, shook her hand energetically as a sign that there was no point thinking of that. "If only he understood us," repeated the father, and by shutting his eyes he absorbed the sister's conviction of the impossibility of this point. Then perhaps some compromise would be possible with him. "But as it is, it must be gotten rid of," cried the sister. "That is the only way, father. You must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we have believed for so long, that is truly our real misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he'd have long ago realized that a communal life among human beings is not possible with such an animal, and would have gone away voluntarily. Then we would not have a brother, but we would go on living and honor his memory. But this animal plagues us. It drives away the lodgers, will obviously take over the entire apartment, and leave us to spend the night in the alley. Just look, father," she suddenly cried out. "He's already starting up again." With a fright which was totally incomprehensible to Gregor, the sister even left the mother, pushed herself away from the chair, as if she would sooner sacrifice her mother than remain in Gregor's vicinity, and rushed behind her father, who, excited merely by her behavior, also stood up and half raised his arms in front of the sister as though to protect her. But Gregor did not have any notion of wishing to create problems for anyone, and certainly not for his sister. He had just started to turn himself around in order to creep back into his room. Quite a startling sight, since as a result of his suffering condition, he had to guide himself through the difficulty of turning around with his head. In this process, lifting and banging it against the floor several times, he paused and looked around. His good intentions seemed to have been recognized. The fright had only lasted for a moment. Now they looked at him with silence and sorrow. His mother lay in her chair, with her legs stretched out and pressed together. Her eyes were almost shut from weariness. The father and sister sat next to one another. The sister had set her hands around the father's neck. "Now, perhaps I can actually turn myself around," thought Gregor, and began the task again. He couldn't stop puffing at the effort, and had to rest now and then. Besides, no one was urging him on. It was all left to him on his own. When he had completed turning around, he immediately began to wander straight back. He was astonished at the great distance which separated him from his room, and did not understand in the least how in his weakness he had covered the same distance in only a short time before, almost without noticing it. Constantly intent only on creeping along quickly, he hardly paid any attention to the fact that no word or cry from his family interrupted him. Only when he was already in the door did he turn his head, and not completely, because he felt his neck growing stiff. At any rate, he still saw that behind him nothing had changed. Only the sister was standing up. His last glimpse brushed over his mother, who was now completely asleep. Hardly was he inside the room when the door was pushed shut very quickly, bolted fast, and barred. Gregor was startled by the sudden commotion behind him, so much so that his little limbs bent double under him. It was his sister, who had been in such a hurry. She had stood up right away, had waited, and had then sprung forward nimbly. Gregor had not heard anything of her approach. She cried out, finally, to her parents, as she turned the key in the lock. What now? Gregor asked himself, and looked around him in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised at that. On the contrary, it struck him as unnatural that he had really been able to move to this point, and with all these little thin legs. Besides, he felt relatively content. True, he had pains throughout his entire body, but it seemed to him that they were gradually becoming weaker and weaker, and would finally go away completely. The rotten apple in his back had inflamed the surrounding area, and, entirely covered with white dust, he hardly noticed. He remembered his family with deep feeling and love. In this business, his own thought that he had to disappear was, if possible, even more decisive than his sister's. He remained in this empty state of peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning. From the window, he witnessed the beginning of the general dawning outside. Then, without willing it, his head sank all the way down, and from his nostrils flowed out weakly his last breath. Early in the morning, the cleaning woman came. In her sheer energy and haste, she banged all the doors, in precisely the way the people had already asked her to avoid, so much so that once she arrived, a quiet sleep was no longer possible anywhere in the entire apartment. In a customarily brief visit to Gregor, she at first found nothing special. She thought he lay so immobile there, intending to play the offended party. She gave him credit for as complete an understanding as possible. Because she happened to hold the long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the floor. When that was quite unsuccessful, she became irritated and poked Gregor a little. And only when she had shoved him from his place without any resistance did she become attentive. When she quickly realized the true state of affairs, her eyes grew large. She whistled to herself, but didn't restrain herself for long. She pulled open the door of the bedroom and yelled in a loud voice into the darkness, "Come and look! It's kicked the bucket! It's lying there, totally snuffed!" The Samsa married couple sat upright in their marriage bed and had to get over the fright at the cleaning woman before they managed to grasp her message. But then Mr. and Miss Samsa climbed very quickly out of bed, one on either side. Mr. Samsa threw the bedspread over his shoulder. Mrs. Samsa came out only in her nightshirt, and like this they stepped into Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room, in which Greet had slept since the lodgers had arrived on the scene, had also opened. She was fully clothed, as if she had not slept at all. Her white face also seemed to indicate that dead? Dead, said Miss Samsa, and looked questioningly at the cleaning woman. Although she could check everything on her own, and even understand without a check. I should say so, said the cleaning woman, and by way of proof, poked Gregor's dead body with a broom a considerable distance more to the side. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as if she wished to restrain the broom, but didn't do it. Well, said Mr. Samsa, now we can give thanks to God. He crossed himself, and the three women followed in his example. Greet, who did not take her eyes off of the corpse, said, Look how thin he is. He had eaten nothing for such a long time. The meals which came in here came out again exactly the same. In fact, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry. That was apparent really for the first time, now that he was no longer raised on his small limbs, and, moreover, now that nothing else distracted one's gaze. Greet, come into us for a moment, said Miss Samsa, with a melancholy smile, and Greet went, not without looking back at the corpse. Behind her parents, into the bedroom. The cleaning woman shut the door and opened the window wide. In spite of the early morning, the fresh air was partly tinged with warmth. It was already the end of March. The three lodgers stepped out of the room and looked around for their breakfast, astonished that they had been forgotten. "Where's the breakfast?" asked the middle one of the gentlemen grumpily to the cleaning woman. However, she laid her finger to her lips, and then quickly and silently indicated to the lodgers that they could come into Gregor's room. So, they came and stood around Gregor's corpse, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat worn jackets, in the room, which was already quite bright. When the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other, all were a little tear-stained. Now and then, Greet pressed her face onto her father's arm. "Get out of my apartment immediately," said Mr. Samsa, and opened the door, without letting go of the woman. "What do you mean?" said the middle lodger, somewhat dismayed and with a sugary smile. The two others kept their hands behind them and constantly rubbed them against each other, as if in joyful anticipation of a great squabble, which must end up in their favor. "I mean exactly what I say," replied Mr. Samsa, and went directly with his two female companions up to the lodger. The latter at which first stood there motionless and looked at the floor, as if matters were arranging themselves in a new way in his head. "All right, then we'll go," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa, as if suddenly overcome by humility. He was asking fresh permission for the decision. Mr. Samsa merely nodded to him, repeatedly, with his eyes open wide. Following that, the lodger actually went immediately with long strides into the hall. His two friends had already been listening for a while, with their hands quite still, and now they hopped smartly after him, as if afraid that Mr. Samsa could step into the hall ahead of them and disturb the reunion with their leader. In the hall, all three of them took their hats and coats from the rack, pulled their canes from the cane holder, bowed silently, and left the apartment. In what turned out to be an entirely groundless mistrust, Mr. Samsa stepped with the two women out onto the landing, leaned against the railing, and looked down as the three lodgers, slowly but steadily, made their way down the long staircase, disappeared on each floor in a certain turn of the stairwell, and in a few seconds came out again. The deeper they proceeded, the more the Samsa family lost interest in them, and when a butcher with a tray on his head came to meet them, and then, with a proud bearing, ascended the stairs high above them, Mr. Samsa, together with the woman, left the banister, and they all returned, as if relieved, back into their apartment. They decided to pass that day resting and going for a stroll. Not only had they earned this break from work, but there was no question that they really needed it. And so, they sat down at the table and wrote 3 letters of apology. Mr. Samsa to his supervisor, Mrs. Samsa to her client, and Greet to her proprietor. During the writing, the cleaning woman came in to say that she was going off, for her morning work was finished. The 3 people writing at first merely nodded, without glancing up. Only when the cleaning woman sat still, unwilling to depart, did they look up angrily. Well? Asked Mr. Samsa. The cleaning woman stood smiling in the doorway, as if she had a great stroke of luck to report to the family, but would only do it if she was asked directly. The almost upright small ostrich feather in her hat, which had irritated Mr. Samsa during her entire service, swayed slightly in all directions then. All right, then. What do you really want? Asked Miss Samsa, whom the cleaning lady still usually respected. Well, answered the cleaning woman, smiling so happily she couldn't go on speaking right away, about how that rubbish from the next room should be thrown out. You mustn't worry about it. It's all taken care of. Miss Samsa and Greet bent down to their letters, as though they wanted to go on writing. Mr. Samsa, who noticed that the cleaning woman wanted to describe everything in detail, decisively prevented her with an outstretched hand. But since she was not allowed to explain, she remembered the great hurry she was in, and called out, clearly insulted, "Ta-ta, everyone," turned around furiously, and left the apartment with a fearful slamming of the door. This evening she'll be let go, said Mr. Samsa, but he got no answer from either his wife or from his daughter, because the cleaning lady seemed to have upset once again the tranquility they had just attained. They got up, went to the window, and remained there, with their arms about each other. Mr. Samsa turned around in his chair in the direction and observed them quietly for a while. Then he called out, "All right, come here then. Let's finally get rid of that old thing, and have a little consideration for me." The woman attended him at once. They rushed to him, caressed him, and quickly ended their letters. Then all three left the apartment together, something they had not done for months now, and took the electric tram into the open air outside the city. The car in which they were sitting by themselves was totally engulfed by the warm sun. They talked to each other, leaning back comfortably in their seats about future prospects, and they discovered that, on closer observation, they were not at all bad, for all three had employment, about which they had not really questioned each other at all, which was really favorable, and with especially promising prospects. The greatest improvement in their situation at this moment, of course, had to come from a change of dwelling. Now, they wanted to rent an apartment smaller and cheaper and better situated and generally more practical than the present one, which Gregor had found. While they amused themselves in this way, it struck Mr. and Mrs. Samsa almost at the same moment how their daughter, who was getting more animated all the time, had blossomed recently, in spite of all her troubles, which had made her cheeks pale, into a beautiful and voluptuous young woman. Growing more silent and almost unconsciously understanding each other in their glances, they thought that the time was now at hand to seek out a good, honest man for her. And it was something of a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when at the end of their journey, the daughter first lifted herself up and stretched her young body. And that is the end of The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Here's your 2-minute book review of, man, what's going on here? They say that this whole book is actually a metaphor about being a young man in general. He turned into a bug, right? And by bug, it means what? He could have gone to work, had his arm broke, and now he's useless, right? He's no better than a bug, really. Bedridden. Maybe the ways that people react to him aren't necessarily the same as they would, but caring for something like this, or modern, contemporarily taking care of your elder relatives, I suppose. I don't know if you've ever gone through this in your own family, but at least in mine and all my friends, they put their grandparents into a home because they really, can't deal with them inside the house. It takes a lot of work. They're locked in a room all day. They just go insane, They'll go just as insane, if not much more insane, inside of an old people home, but at least then you don't have to look at it, right? I've heard the same reports of people with or old people, with dementia. Maybe not even old people, but people with dementia. It's the people it's hardest on really isn't the individual themselves who has the disease, but rather all the people around them who have to experience every day their downfall, and see how this person fall apart, this person that you loved for your whole life, right? This is your dad, your grandparents. You get to see them turn into a senile coot, and much more than a senile coot, just a ghost of a person, right? That's a tragedy. I would hate to see that. In some sense, that's what this is. The family overnight gets to see the one working person in their household, the breadwinner of the family, and much more so, the entire thing that kept the family together, all at once turned into nothing, basically. And what that's a metaphor, who knows? Could be dementia, probably not. Could be a broken limb. Just the one good for something person in the family turns into nothing overnight, right? And in saying that, he's absolutely no better than a bug, right? I thought I read a synopsis of the story long ago. I thought that Gregor, towards the end, transforms into a flying bug and flies out the window. I thought that's how this ended. I didn't know that he dies. I was actually kind of surprised by that a little bit, I'll say. What more is there to say? I guess all of this is in general to say that, man, this capitalist pig utopia really not be putting it together, huh? Maybe that's what it drives at. Who knows? The third analysis of this that you could say is that this isn't about anything at all. It's about a guy who turns into a bug and it sucks. But is that really the case? Probably not. This probably is a whole metaphor for something, but I don't know. I'm no Wizzy, right? Lean Wizzy, tripping out on the streets on the young Dilla, okay? That's who I gotta be. I'm not one for this educational stuff. Also, let me give you a quick update. In the last part of this, or the previous reading, part 5, I said, I'm drinking my fine wine. After recording that, I immediately was in a pissy mood and I fell asleep. It is now tomorrow morning and I'm drinking coffee, and I gotta say, guys, feels great. That's my life. Hope y'all are doing wonderful. Suddenly, I sure am, and I could not tell you why. Anyways, okay, y'all have a great night. Don't forget that I love you and that you must like, comment, favorite, subscribe. Catch you next time. Don't forget to recommend me cool stuff to read in the comments, and I will read it for you for free. Don't forget, it was all free. I didn't put any ads on this garbage yet. Anyways, I was thinking about reading, what was it? At least the first couple chapters of, My Immortal. I feel like that would be at least moderately entertaining. Maybe the first, 3. And cut it off there before my head explodes. Anyways, I'll catch y'all later. Goodbye.